Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Farms and Frontlines. I am Max Terzano and I am joined by my co-host Major Jessica Rudo.
Hey there, how's it going? Like Max said, I'm a major in the Army. I teach history at West Point. Just right up front, everything that we talk about is our own opinions. My own opinions do not reflect anything to do with the military at all. But we are here to talk about food.
Yeah, we're here to talk about food security, and how that relates to global security. And just sometimes we'll talk about other fun food-related, security-related issues, but primarily this podcast is going to be looking at food security and how that relates to global security at large.
Any
This is
point that
something.
food and conflict kind of brush up against each other. That's kind of where we're looking at.
Absolutely. I mean, this is like we've talked about this a lot, and this is something that, what was it, like 2 years, really?
Yep. Yep. We've been talking about this for, just about 2 years. And we just thought that, hey, we like talking about this. Maybe some other people would like to hear us too. Join in.
That's the hope.
Yeah, join our conversation because it's really fascinating and it affects everybody.
And we do have a little bit of a history talking about this stuff, and more than just casual conversation. I know, Jess, you spoke to the Norwegian military.
I did, yeah. So for this first episode, what we're going to look at is the Russian-Ukraine conflict and how that's affecting food security. And that's exactly what I talked about. Went to Norway, spoke to the Norwegian military, thinking, outside of the direct conflict, how does what's happening in Ukraine affect other countries writ large? And I said, we got to look at the food and how fragile our system is. But you
That
also did too, right?
I
You
did,
also did.
yes. I was writing a paper for a master's degree in food and agricultural law and policy. I was
Mhm.
looking at global food security and the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is something that popped up because of this conflict. I was looking at how that affected a lot of countries, primarily countries in the Horn of Africa, which
Yeah.
was just super interesting, seeing shipping lanes and all that kind of stuff, which we'll touch on a little bit later. This conflict, just through the lens of food in general, it really did highlight how fragile global food security really is, how easily it's disrupted.
We were doing some of this research in parallel, and then we kind of started talking about it, be like, oh, we are looking at the same thing just through a different lens.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. So that's what we're going to talk about for this first one.
absolutely, and it's we'll just dive right in because it really is extremely interesting. This first part A of the first episode, we're just going to kind of do a quick overview of the history leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and talking about, we'll lead up to the Black Sea Grain Initiative that I previously mentioned, how that was formed, why it inevitably failed. And then episode two, or part two of this episode, is going to be super fascinating, where Ukraine has to figure out ways to get around the Russian Black Sea blockade. They start taking wheat through like overland routes. There's a bunch of issues that arise there, and so hang with us. We'll get to all this super fun stuff. But this started in, obviously, Ukraine became an actual country, recognized country, after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in December 5th, 1994, they signed the Budapest Memorandum with Russia, right?
Yep. Yep. And that's basically where Ukraine agrees to hand over their nukes in exchange for a promise from Russia not to invade, which went
Which,
super well, as we've
yeah,
seen.
as we can see, that worked out really well. But things were kind of, after that. I mean, things were kind of all right for like a decade, because
in
the
in general, right? In general,
yeah,
nothing super noteworthy that's going to shape future conflicts. But right, 2004, we kind of jump ahead a decade to the Orange Revolution, which is pretty significant.
right, because that was where we had. I mean, I vaguely remember this. I was much younger at the time, but this was where there was a presidential election between Viktor Yushchenko, who was a
Hmm.
Western-oriented candidate, and a name you might remember more more not frequently, but what's the word I'm looking for here?
Readily?
Yeah, I guess more readily, is Viktor Yanukovych. He was supported by Russia, and there was this massive controversy over the election. Yushchenko, the Western candidate, was poisoned mysteriously before the election. He was able to recover, but victory was declared in favor of Yanukovych. However, for obvious reasons, the election was widely seen as fraudulent. And Ukrainians afterwards took to the street wearing orange, which was Yushchenko's campaign color. And by December, they were able to force a revote, which resulted in victory for Yushchenko taking the presidency.
Yeah. And then 2008, Russia fights Ukrainian NATO membership, which we point out because, we hear this again in 2022. And I think it's just important to note that there is a lot of reference back to a verbal agreement between Western powers and Russia on where that NATO line was drawn and the promise to not move it east. However, several times it's been moved east.
Right.
And 2008, there's a plan to put membership documents in for Ukraine, and there is a backlash from it's Putin. It's Putin then.
Yeah, it's still Putin.
Yeah, it's still Putin. A couple months later, in August of 2008, the Russo-Georgian conflict kicks off. And while there is a ton of history behind that, something that we want to point out, some of the rhetoric that was used in this Georgian conflict is Russia declared that there was a genocide happening wrongly and says that their invasion is tied to peace enforcement operations. And I'm quoting that. So we hear this again in 2022, right? So we'll tie back to that, but we do in 2008, Putin is saying we have to invade to keep the peace. So interesting.
Yeah, and that was obviously a less of an invasion involving Ukraine. They obviously Russia was busy with the Georgian conflict.
Sure.
Didn't want to be too split, but they were still trying to fight that the NATO membership for reasons that make a lot more sense today.
Yeah.
Jumping to November 2013, there are the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine, which prompt another sudden change in government. Yanukovych ran for president again, and he won in 2010. But he ran promising to work towards a relationship with the European Union. He had been in these talks with the EU to establish trade and do all the things that the people of the Ukraine wanted. But EU wanted them to stop trade with Russia.
Which is important to note that Russia was their biggest trade partner by a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, a very large margin, where I think the EU was offering them like 150 million.
It's like 600 and something million.
Okay, yeah, so 600. Yeah, it was 660 million pound loan.
Yeah.
But which they countered with saying like we would need at least 2 billion pounds to make up for and modernize our economy.
Right, and Russia offered them like a $1.2 billion loan. So
yeah, which kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place there.
Yeah. And the other thing is that the EU gave Yanukovych a timeline. So the papers are kind of like, everybody's in talks, everybody's talking, and then the timeline hits, and Yanukovych is like, I can't do this. We're not in terms where it's like favorable for Ukraine. And then the papers are kind of like, he's ditching it. He's just, like.
Yep.
So there's quite a few things that are like leading up to get the people riled up that lead to these protests. Yeah.
Right. And then, I mean, like you said, it does happen. They do get riled up. There is a massive protest because they think he's just switching sides, going back to being a pro-Russian candidate. Protests really are about this like perceived government corruption that has been created by like the papers and all that, everything leading up to this. So protests around the country, centering in Maidan Square in Kiev. And I remember I was in college at the time, and I remember seeing these, like the images and all of this crazy stuff going on. A bunch of people are killed, at least 130 people, civilians. Yanukovych flees to Russia, which obviously, like, your legacy's kind of set in stone now, no matter how much you were trying beforehand.
Yeah.
You fled to Russia. New leadership is elected, committing to orienting Ukraine towards the European Union. The Euromaidan protests last roughly until February 2014, which leads right into Russia seizing Crimea, which created international outrage. But as we were alluding to, it when we were talking about this episode, it happened so fast.
Yeah, it's in like less than a week.
Yeah,
It's quick.
it was like a couple of days. It created, this international outrage, but there was no response to it. It was just like, you can't do that, but
Hey,
you
that's
did
not
it,
nice.
so don't do it again.
I know, maybe? Question
Yeah,
mark.
like nobody really knew how to react, like, because Russia came in again saying, like, these Crimeans are Russians, essentially, like they want us to be here.
And they were asking, and there were pro-Russian protests happening.
Exactly. So it's like they weren't far off, but like you can't just come in and annex part of another country.
Which, like we talked about, there is quite a bit of history there.
Yes.
So, for us as Westerners, just to see this, it looks a certain way that we're like, this doesn't seem right.
Right. And I remember when I was, younger and reading about it, I was like, what the heck? But then
Yeah.
it's a lot more, I don't want to say nuanced, but like there were people in Crimea saying, we are Russians. We want Russia to come in and take us, and they did. But
Yeah.
obviously that doesn't sit well with Ukraine for,
Right.
the next 5 years, when in 2019 you get a new election where we see President Zelensky is elected.
Yeah. Yep.
And
I think
he had,
Zelensky also is a interesting character.
he's super interesting.
Yeah, like we were talking about. So he's an actor, he's an outsider to the political realm. He is a native Russian speaker.
Mm-hmm.
He learns Ukrainian for this
For the
show that
TV show, right?
a
Yeah.
TV show where he plays the president.
Which is just, it's
Um,
wild, because the party in the show was the party of the people or something, right?
right. And then in real life, they make this party
The
after
servant of the
the
people.
show.
Yep, that's his real life political party now. Is the
af-
servant of the people.
After the show, which I just think is so crazy.
It really is. It truly is. Like it's insane that he was a comedian who played
But he's
president
playing like a
for
puppet
this.
president. Like
Yeah.
he's getting played by a bunch of people.
Mm-hmm.
So
Where it was
hopefully
funny
that's
in that aspect, but
but hopefully it's not in real
yeah,
life.
hopefully
That's
not in real life.
funny.
Servant of the people. Obviously, anybody anybody who has any familiarity with this conflict is familiar with Zelensky, his staunch
Mhm.
support of the Ukrainian people and everything he's doing to fight Russia and support Ukraine.
Yeah. So and he's been very smart in how he plays, social media,
Mm-hmm.
his public portrayal. So very smart in that aspect.
Unfortunately, things would not be all smooth sailing for President Zelensky.
Hmm.
It's February 21, 2022. Russia recognizes the breakaway regions of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, as sovereign, and the Ukrainian government considered them to be Russian-backed terrorists leading those areas.
Yeah.
Russia recognizes them as sovereign, and 3 days later, Russia launches their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is important because we mentioned earlier that Russia had entered Georgia as
Right.
there to on these peacekeeping or peace enforcement missions.
Right.
But when Putin recognized the territories as independent states, and he sent troops in to quote unquote keep the peace,
Right.
and then 3 days later launches a full scale invasion of Ukraine.
Right. And some of the rhetoric I think that also comes out. There's the Nazi brigade. Um,
Oh right.
again, like hints not towards a genocide. He never said there was a genocide happening, but needed to denazify the not the situation, but the area. um, which is again like another
Just
callback to some just irony.
right, just
Like
Putin using rhetoric to
yeah.
like just try to push his agenda forward.
And in areas where he was able to take a location pretty quickly.
Yes.
Which we can see obviously 2 years later, like that did not happen with Ukraine.
No, and I think I think the world fully thinks he thought he was just going to go in, steamroll it, and be like,
Right,
"Yep, this is all mine now."
right, exactly. Very similar to what was going on in parts of Georgia and then Crimea.
Yep. And I mean, I think if like full transparency, like if he had just moved the troops into Donetsk and Luhansk and was like, "These are mine,"
Mm-hmm.
I think the world would have wagged another finger at him.
Yeah.
But he probably would have kept those regions. Like Ukraine probably would have, if
And
this is just me speculating, but Ukraine would have probably fought it and yelled against it. But it wasn't this full scale invasion that has
right.
led Congress to send billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine for.
Yeah. It's probably similar to the areas in Georgia, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
very pro-Russian. They speak
Yep,
Russian. There's things that would align those areas and the people that live in it with Russia.
exactly.
So you're probably right. There probably would have been much less, you know,
To do.
resistance. Right. Much less to do. Much less to
Just
talk
to
about
do.
today.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but instead he got cocky and launched a full
hmm
scale invasion, which,
hmm
as we know, is it's still going on and not going
Right.
well for Russia.
Right.
But that leads us to February 2022 through July, where
Of
there's
23. Yeah.
a July of 2023 where this conflict is causing chaos kind of worldwide, and
Yeah.
that brings
So
us to the food aspect.
yeah. So to set the stage, Ukraine and Russia together make about 30% of the world's wheat supply. And wheat, is just a part of everything. Everything we're eating, right? A lot of
Mm-hmm.
a lot of areas rely on calories that come from wheat.
Yep.
So that's a huge number, right? Worldwide, globally, that is a huge number of tons and tons and tons of wheat that get exported from Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
just want everybody to think about
yeah,
that for a minute. Like 30% of the world's wheat.
right,
Like it's not
right.
just Europe, it's not just Asia, which
Yeah,
this is worldwide is 30%, which is a massive amount.
yeah. And the way that really, really globally, but more industrialized nations eat is they eat what they want to eat when they want to eat it. Like
Yeah.
not seasonally, not when it's
Mm-hmm.
available,
Right.
which has led to a global food chain of you know every food getting sent everywhere all the time.
Right.
So we're all connected. So the stuff that's coming out of Russia and Ukraine affects literally the globe. So the ripple
Yes.
effects of this conflict we can see starting right away in February. So the beginning of February, even before any of these conflicts that we talked about in terms of like the current Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia sets up a blockade. They're starting to set up or what will become the blockade of the Black Sea. They're putting ships in place. They're kind of not responding to like, hey, why are your ships there?
Right. Right. Right.
From international pressure. They're like, don't worry about it. It's an
I think,
exercise.
yeah, they were saying it was like a training
Mhm.
exercise, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But it has impeded, the beginning of February, there's an impediment in exports leaving the Black Sea. The conflict kicks off February 24th. The blockade is put into place. And when that blockade is put in, something like two-thirds of the world's ships are in the Black Sea, stuck.
Right.
So even just that little bit, just like stopping food movement in February, creates this effect where the UN is declaring that it is the worst food crisis in history, which is a huge claim, especially for an area like Ukraine that has
Mm-hmm.
seen, right, the Great Ukrainian Famine, the
Right.
Holodomor,
Mm-hmm.
the man-made famine in the 30s that killed billions.
Right.
The hunger plan during World War II, again, millions are starved out by German occupiers.
Mm-hmm.
So for the
And this
UN to say,
is this is
go
yeah,
ahead,
for them to say this is bigger than those.
is just kind of trying to show like the emphasis that this is going to get bad.
Yeah, and I think it's
Um,
only compounded on the fact that
mhm,
like this is February 2022. Like we're
that's right.
barely over COVID, this whole
Right.
pandemic,
Right.
like which
Right.
had already made things very difficult.
Yeah. Really highlighting like how fragile our food system is, and then compounded with the security aspect, like how do we get our food and how external agents can really affect like when we get it, how we get it, the price that we're paying for it.
Hmm.
So all of that is what we're seeing coming out of this. And, tying it back to why we started talking about this, it was these things that really got us interested. Like, why are we paying, 15% higher prices for groceries?
Yeah.
And when you and I were looking at this, we saw areas of the world that are really, like, really hit by this. And you were talking about like the Horn of Africa,
Hmm.
increases in their food spending in the thousands of percentage, like
Thousands, like it was like
yeah,
3,000% increase.
increase in
And
some
like
areas.
these are not wealthy nations. Like the folks there can't afford that. Like it's
Hmm.
so there was this massive famine in the Horn of Africa and Somalia, Ethiopia, which it's hard to get people to care about because there's always some issue, whether it's pirates or
Pirates,
Al
right?
Shabaab or something terrible. But it was just I remember reading, and it was just a devastating read where people were literally starving to death, children were starving to death, just trying to get out of the country. And
Yeah.
like, well, where's the food going? Because then you read it stopped. A lot of their food comes through the Black Sea and gets dropped off in like Djibouti and then
Yep.
kind of transported around there for obvious reasons. Not too many shipments get dropped off in Somalia,
Right.
but they do get there are ways to get food through the Horn and to the people that need it. But the price of food just went skyrocketed after this, and they weren't getting any food. And then that brings us to the Black Sea Grain Initiative
Yeah.
between the Ukraine and Russia, because Russia also realized we're not getting any of our exports out. Like
Right.
our food's not
Exactly.
getting out as well. Like I think it ties back to Russia thinking it was going to be over very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Like a little pressure on, hey, you can't get anything out. Now you have some international attention, but then we see, food is now a leverage. It's now being used in the diplomatic sense.
It absolutely was, because it wasn't. I don't think it was really on anybody's mind. I mean, maybe folks who are like live and breathe in that sector were like, oh, this is really
Hmm.
going to affect things, but when it first happened, it was more like, what are you doing, Russia? Like,
Exactly.
this is a military operation. Like, it was seen more like just like it was security, but not so much food security at the time.
Right, right.
And then
Well,
they
the immediate,
realized,
yeah, of course, because the immediate thing is like people are being, there's areas being bombed. There's,
yes, yes,
soldiers being called in, which makes sense.
exactly,
Just
exactly,
just smart to also not forget that there are second and third order effects to those military movements. Yeah.
right. And that leads to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Like we said,
Mhm.
Turkey brought the two to the table of
Which,
of all
yeah,
nations.
Turkey is the mediate, like the
Yeah,
mediating country. Like, where are we at in the world that this
yeah,
is happening?
yeah. And like they ended up with an actual result, a
Hmm.
multinational deal backed by the UN, which, as I mentioned, was called the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and it was an agreement between the two countries to allow a certain amount of vessels to leave through the Black Sea and get through the blockade and go deliver the grain to wherever the ships were going.
Yeah. Yep. And then, along with wheat, there's corn, other foodstuffs that are
Yeah,
going out.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes, getting all the
Yeah.
foodstuffs. We mostly just mentioned wheat because it's a primary
Yeah. Yeah.
export from that region, but there are a lot of other things going through.
Hmm.
And
But then,
for some like context, these it sounds like a good deal, right? Like, okay, yeah, we'll let ships out, they'll go do their thing, we can keep fighting, we're still going to put the pressure on you,
hmm,
but people will get food. Part of the deal with these independent inspectors, these like independent
right.
inspections that would go on, there were like 11
Yeah.
11
I think
inspectors.
11 or 12, but yeah,
Yeah, which is
a dozen or less. Yeah.
like as you mentioned earlier, 2/3 of the world's ships
Right.
were in the Black Sea, and you provide 11 or 12
Right.
inspectors. So these inspections took a long time,
Right.
and ships were trying to get loaded up and get out. And these are massive barges, right? Like they're not like a little motorboat filled with a couple like
Yeah.
bags
And
of grain. Like
like a month, typically, like 6 million tons of food would leave the Black Sea. So you're talking about it, yeah, again, like a huge volume of
yeah,
things
like
that need to be
six
inspected.
million tons of food
Yeah.
was before the invasion, typically coming in
Yeah.
and out of the Black Sea, like or leaving the Black Sea, which is
Hmm.
a ton. And you have 12 people to go through
Yeah.
6 million tons of food.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's just insane. So obviously ships were
Weird.
kind of trickling out, like, and it was
Weirdly,
nowhere
it doesn't
near.
go. But
Yeah,
then, right,
oddly enough.
weird, it doesn't work that as anticipated. However, when they can get out, where do they go? Right? Which we
That's
thought was fascinating. Like the
absolutely. It was whoever paid to get the grain out.
and it
It
was
was
Spain and China. Those were the
Spain and China
two leading countries that got a
by
huge
far.
majority of the wheat that first got when it first opened up. Spain and China, which Spain we were like, what? And
Yeah.
we thought maybe it's like a hub, right? It goes to Spain and then it goes to other places. But from what we could tell, we couldn't find any evidence that showed like it went to Spain and then it like redistributed across Europe. Like it
It,
looked like it went to Spain to feed the pigs, like their
yeah.
pig industry, which is huge.
Yeah. Which is, like you really hate when it's, I mentioned that there was a massive famine
Mm-hmm.
and folks were literally dying just trying to like get out. And it's
Yeah,
like, no, we're going to pay for all that so we can feed our pigs,
because that's
which
how they make their money. Yeah,
exactly
yeah.
like it makes sense. But then on the other hand, you're just like, oh man, I hate everything about
I
this.
know exactly.
Um, and the UN World Food Program would also buy food and they would ship it to places like Djibouti, and they even dropped some off in Somalia, which is impressive.
Yeah, but
But it was
again,
a meager
all,
amount.
and all the food that is coming from the UN food program is coming out of Ukraine. So it has to go through
Yes.
the same process. It has to get past the inspectors and get out of the Black Sea. So they can, set aside a certain amount for areas in anywhere else that isn't in first world country.
Hmm.
It's still going to take forever for it to get out though. Like, and
Yeah.
that's what we saw. I think it took months before it got anywhere outside of Spain, China, or other like super industrialized country.
Yeah. If it even
Yeah.
got to there, like
Yeah.
it was kind of insane. It was really just it's not something you think about, like
Hmm.
who's paying for ship payments, like where are the vessels
Hmm.
going. It's not like it's on some like coordinated, make sure everybody gets a fair share. It's like who's paying for
Oh
it.
yeah. Right.
You know,
Exactly.
it's just it's not surprising when you think about it, but then
Mhm.
if you're not thinking about it, like, oh wait,
Well, you
no,
think
yeah, I
there's
guess that makes
people
sense.
associated. Yeah. Like people are trying to eat on the other end of that versus
Hmm.
like, companies are paying for a commodity. Yeah. So it stinks.
It
But I do
does.
want to say that the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the UN had a really up to date, very detailed tracker of
Love that thing.
who, yeah, they updated it. It was like a live update. It was really neat.
So cool.
Um, of who was going where with what. So you could,
It ship numbers, the
yep,
shipping routes, like it was
where the
really
ship
cool.
flags that the ship flew.
Hmm.
So, it's not us speculating, it's us looking at that data in real time, showing like where these shipments were going and who was getting what. And
Hmm.
they break it down the same way. So the UN breaks it down like, industrialized, non-industrialized, who got what percentage of it. And you'll see it's very overwhelmingly industrialized countries got the food first and
Right.
the larger percentage of it. Yeah. So
Right. Which
it was, and kudos to them for doing that because that was a really, it's just raw data and you could look at it and make your own assumptions, but it was a really neat tool to see and follow while it was going on.
I'm sorry, I forget, but when did the Black Sea Grain Initiative begin? It was like February 20.
No, no, when does it begin? I thought it was, it's a couple months afterwards. I thought it was July.
I know it ended July 2023.
Right, but I think that's the year later because that was hold on. Let me
Okay.
do a little Google search.
Yeah, no, I should know this, but
Let's see. Black Sea Grain Initiative went into effect in July of 22 and
okay, so
ended
you're right.
July of 23. Yeah.
Okay. Okay,
There
perfect.
it was originally like a 6-month deal, 6 or 9 months, and then it gets extended. Um, and then Russia doesn't extend it again. It lets it time out.
Right. In July of 2023, they kind of thought that they weren't getting a fair shake, that they were
Correct.
being kind of discriminated against by
Right.
the inspectors.
Inspectors, yeah.
And they decided to not renew it. So it ended in July 2023 after working and to a moderate success, I would say,
Yeah. Yeah.
for about a year. But I think they think like, okay, we're not going to renew it. We're going to put the screws back to Ukraine, and we're going to get the upper hand here.
Right, again, using that diplomatic leverage, using food
Hmm.
as that diplomatic leverage, because they suspended it in November of 22. People came back to the table and, talked again, and then just, yeah, it didn't happen again. They let it terminate in July.
They did, and I think they, like I said, I think they thought that they were going to be getting the upper hand here. As
Yeah.
we know now, and we'll talk about in the next part of this episode, things don't go well for Russia after they back out of this.
Yeah, really, really neat to see like the innovation that comes out of a struggle, right? And it's so I guess that's what we'll look at next.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Ukraine really could have been like, well, this is terrible. I don't know what to do here. But the way they went with it instead was unlike anything I think we've seen before, especially in this theater.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and we'll see how that affects future conflicts too, for sure.
which is super fascinating. So we'll talk about everything that happens after Russia backs out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and how Ukraine really uses some innovative thinking to work their way out of it.
Yeah.
So
I know. I want to give like a teaser, like sea babies.
yeah, stay tuned for Sea Babies if
It's
that
crazy.
interests you. It's a lot cooler than it sounds, I swear.
I mean, it sounds pretty cool.
And it's even cooler.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of just a brief overview of everything that led up to what's kind of going on now. Tune into the next episode. We'll talk about everything that happens after the Black Sea Grain Initiative ends and current state of affairs, how the Ukraine has kind of moved forward and different challenges that they have had to work with and overcome, including overland routes and just different foreign entities kind of impeding progress in the next episode. So thanks again for listening and hope you'll continue to listen.
Thank you.